Welcome. You're listening to another episode of AML Conversations, where we sit down with some of the brightest minds in the financial industry to explore topical matters around financial crime and compliance. We hope you enjoy this discussion, and please be sure to subscribe for more.
How are you doing today, Mark?
Hey, John, I'm good. How are you?
Good. Hey, thanks for taking some time with me. I'm here with Mark Freedman, who's the CEO and founder of Rebel Global Security. And Mark, typically when I talk to folks like yourself that have gone from the public sector to the private sector, it's always interesting what they've learned. And I know you've been in the private sector for a bit, but what they've learned in terms of the challenges. Like I can tell you that some of our peers in, say, the FBI, for example, when they go into the private sector, they realized how much of like banking activity they didn't really understand, and it could happen vice versa if you go into the government. So I'm always interested in folks like yourself who had a long distinguished career at the State Department and worked with a lot of agencies. When you moved to the private sector, give us a sense of the differences there, high level, like what you saw that you knew that these were challenges, but perhaps different ones than the ones you worked on in the public sector.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, John. And first of all, thanks again for having me on. Great to be here. So, when I was in the public sector, as you mentioned, I was at the State Department, and I worked on international security issues. I was in the Political Military Affairs Bureau and then in the Counter-Terrorism Bureau. I worked there really kind of through the 2010s and saw a lot of the evolution there. I was focused on counterterrorism policy, and so the evolution from kind of Al Qaeda to ISIS,
Right.
everything that happened in Syria and Libya and the Arab Spring, and and then kind of on the tail end, and as I moved into the private sector, on the tail end of the 2010s and into the early 2020s, I saw this transition from the war on terror, as it was called, which really was the dominating force in U.S. foreign policy and national security policy for 20 years.
Right.
And toward what is now alternatively called great power competition or interstate strategic competition, with kind of the the rise once again of Russia and China as state concerns. And so I give that little bit of background because there are certainly differences between the ways that the public sector and the private sector think about security challenges, and we can get into some of that discussion.
Yeah.
But increasingly, what's remarkable to me is how much the challenges and the threats are shared. When I was working on counterterrorism policy, the government always talked a lot about how the private sector needs to do more, right? That is not a new statement. Private sector needs to do more to shore up its defenses, to protect itself. But I think that has evolved very rapidly from something that is said and is a talking point to something that is taken extremely seriously, given just the extent of the vulnerability, particularly in U.S. critical infrastructure, which is, as you know, 85% of critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. And so, there are differences in how people look at it. The government is focused on all security all the time in a way, and private sector security is one thing among many other things that's usually is viewed as a cost center. It's often kind of overlooked or dealt with as necessary to comply with regulations. So it's not the kind of dominating factor that it is in the government. But the challenges nowadays, I think, are remarkably similar. I mean, the government is very concerned about catastrophic cyber attacks against private companies. And I just in a few minutes before I jumped on with you, I saw a report that just came out that said, that assessment is matched by executives in boardrooms, right? The
Right.
top risk that they're concerned about right now is catastrophic cyber attacks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, coming from the financial industry like I have, decades ago, we decided that the private sector had an obligation to be proactive. So I always sort of got my back up when we would hear our public sector friends say, "Hey, we need to do more," because the counter argument would always be, "Well, you got to give us some information so we can be better equipped to do that due diligence." But in the cyberspace and some of the other things that you've worked on, as you just said, a lot of the information, the protection of the infrastructure is in the private sector. So it sort of flips that on its head, right? So it's more, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but more high level that it's the private sector sort of filling in the gaps that the public sector might have. And like you say, working together now seems to be a lot easier to accomplish than perhaps when you started in this space, or certainly when I started decades ago.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on, right? And we need to, in the private sector, be acknowledging and recognizing that paradigm shift. Again, I look at this in broad strokes, right? So you're looking at counterterrorism being the driving force for the U.S. government for so long, and the things that I worked on, most of the stuff that you do for counterterrorism is handled by the government. I mean, private sector, that there is, as you know, in the financial space in particular, there is stuff that falls on the private sector, especially in the AML CFT space. But most of the private sector, you secure your assets in the same way that you would typically secure your assets, and the chances that you get hit by Al Qaeda or ISIS, with a car bombing or suicide, but it happens, but the chances that it happens to your organization is relatively remote. And the government provides most of the tools that are necessary to stop the threat, whether that's, like at the State Department, I led the piece of it that, focused on engaging foreign governments. But, watch listing and law enforcement and prosecutions, and then there's the military angle, obviously, those are all government functions. When you talk about cyber, and it's not just cyber, by the way, we'll get into kind of, what goes beyond cyber, but
Right.
when you talk about cyber and the vulnerabilities that can be exploited nowadays, that barrier that the United States government was able to form on terrorism issues is not there, right? I mean, the government can do pieces here and there to protect companies from cyber threats. You can try to equip them with information. You can give them guidance on what to do, what patches need to be made, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, that responsibility lays with the private sector company. And from a private sector company standpoint, yeah, you're saying, look, I have limited resources. I'm a business. I'm not a security organization. And so I can only do so much. Now, where I think that line of logic kind of meets its end is, what we've seen over the last couple of years is that, you have a major cyber breach. And right. Especially if a foreign government or a major foreign criminal organization is involved, or if it impacts critical infrastructure, your name is in the headlines, right? It's on the front page of the New York Times, and that can be a company killer. I mean, that's, that can be game over. Your stock price may never recover. So the companies, they have an interest now more than they ever have in taking a broader and more holistic view of security issues.
Yeah, you wrote an op-ed piece that in the Security Info Watch that I was very interested in, because you make the comment, you amplify the comment that you just made, right? That the private sector should be making strategic changes to their infrastructure on broadly based national security issues. So you not call out in a negative sense, but you make the case that security officers and chief information security officers, while some of that's already happening, they are working with, as you say, their public sector counterparts. There could be more done. So with that as the premise, besides cyber attacks, what are some of the other global challenges? You obviously mentioned the geopolitical world that you were part of. I would argue that corruption is a major driver internationally of all sorts of problems, right? So, from your perspective, being in this space and now being in the private sector, what are the types of issues that you want to see these CEOs and CISOs work with their counterparts in the government beyond cyber? I realize cyber is sort of the connecting point of all these crimes and issues, but just in general, what's your view on all of that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of a perspective shift that's necessary. You've got let me lay it out like this. I'm a kind of management consultant, and so I like to simplify things into easily understandable frameworks, right? And I think as we look into the global threat environment, it's so complex that we need to do some simplification on what we're talking about. So you've got your global threat actors, right? Which is the individuals or the entities or countries or organizations that could do you harm. And from the US government's perspective, or at least the DoD's perspective, they're really concerned about a top four there, which is Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Those are your state actors. And then you've got your non-state actors, which is essentially terrorists and criminal organizations, particularly cyber criminals and ransomware gangs. So that's kind of on the actor piece. Then you've got your vectors, and vectors being how are those actors going to potentially attack your organization? And I view cyber as one of those vectors, and I think that's in line with how most of the U.S. government and national security community think about it. Cyber is one piece of a broader whole. There's also physical attacks. There's espionage. There's increasingly, as you know, John, a lot of talk about mis and disinformation.
Right.
And so, information has become a threat vector in itself. And so, I think that security executives in private companies need to take a step back and look at that whole environment. So many of the solutions in the private sector are, in my mind, tactically focused. You've got a physical security solution, you've got a cybersecurity solution, you've got endpoint protection, you got a travel risk program. Well, let's take a step back and view the organization as a whole, right? And what does the global threat environment look like? Where is the organization's position within that environment? And what are the multitude of threats and how they could get in? And my CT person, by background, and so my mind goes to pre 9/11, and the idea of Al-Qaeda was able to slip through the cracks of a lack of interagency coordination, particularly between the FBI and the CIA. And I think it's an analogous situation in private sector companies today. You've often got a physical security department that's in a completely different command chain from the cybersecurity department. What are they doing to talk to each other and to maintain a broader picture of the global threat environment so that something doesn't slip through the cracks?
Yeah, the 9/11 Commission report made it clear in a very easy to understand phrase, the lack of imagination. So I think that does apply to both the private and public sector. Let me ask you about the private sector in this way. You've already made some good, provided some insight in terms of why an individual institution should think about being more proactive because of the impact on that institution. But the example that I point to is about a decade ago, the broader AML community, mainly the financial sector, recognized from the bottom up, right, from staff within financial institutions that human trafficking was both a horrific crime, but it impacted all communities. So it wasn't just big cities, it wasn't border town, it was everywhere. And that there was a financial component to that, that if the financial sector was better at identifying that, they could help their law enforcement partners investigate, prosecute, detect, and not never, unfortunately, going to stop it, but put a big hole in it. And so that was an interesting example where the bank individually doesn't always think, oh, okay, if I spend this money to do this sort of proactive investigating, that'll be beneficial to the community. I'm not saying that banks don't care about the community, because they do, but I think this was an example of, we have to think beyond our region, beyond our institution, and I think to some degree it's been successful. So long-winded saying, how do you make the same case to CEOs and chief risk officers in financial institutions or any other institution, frankly, that if you do more strategically about national security issues, it may not impact your individual entity immediately, or may be sort of collateral impact, but there's a value proposition for the country, the community, the world. I know it sounds a little, over the top, but I would think getting in front of a CEO and a CRO and saying, here's why you need to amend and change your strategy, because at the end of the day, it's going to help not just your institution, but your, other things that are relevant, supply chains, what have you. Is there but not an easy way of doing that, but what's your thought process about people that bring you in? They want to think about a strategic change, but they're really worried about the bottom line.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. There are two pieces to this. And the first is on the bottom line. I mean, and that's where everything needs to be focused. And at the end of the day, you're talking about private sector companies. They're there to make money. They're not necessarily there. It can be a secondary or tertiary goal to support national security or help the community, but that is typically not why they exist. And so it makes sense that executives are focused on the bottom line. They should be focused on the bottom line. I think that on that piece of it, it's about helping executives understand that an awareness of these issues and what's going on in the world, the threats that are mounting, which are just, this is just starting, by the way. I mean, what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine and the tensions with China, I mean, this is the beginning of multi-year, multi-decade, global conflict, I think that's starting here. So, but, you got to be aware of those things in order to protect the bottom line. Because if you're not aware of them, if you don't make and these are easy organizational changes that I'm talking about, closing the gaps and how you think about security within your organization, something could happen. And if it's big enough, there is no bottom line anymore. It's done. The company as I mentioned, it's a company killer. But I think on your second point, there is also, I think, a growing conversation around it used to be called corporate social responsibility. The name has kind of changed over the years, and I think in executives, look, it's a hot topic, right? It's a controversial issue in a lot of ways, but some executives, I think, believe that you want to do more on those things. You want to lean forward in doing positive things for your community, or working proactively with the government to support the national interest. You've seen this, for example, from some of the tech giants, right, who have made it very clear in recent years that they want to work with the Defense Department. Now, part of that, again, goes back to the bottom line. They want the government contracts. But part of it is also, I think, a good approach to demonstrating that the major American tech companies should have a level of patriotism and should support the United States when it comes to conflict with China and other adversarial powers. So I think there's multiple tracks here to what you've raised, John, and executives need to be thinking at each of those levels.
Yeah, it's probably similar to ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance. So I think that's right. And I think, whether it was the reaction to the George Floyd murders, whether it was reaction to, other challenges in our country, I think a number of corporations did step up. Obviously, the unfortunate counter to that was some of the misinformation, which we don't have really time to get into now. But I do think that that's right. And I think the more that we make people aware, and talking to people like yourself helps us do that, the more corporations sit up like they did with human trafficking and say, we can do more here, and it will be beneficial broadly speaking, even if it's not financially beneficial. So let me do this. Let me get you out of here on this. Given all that you're working on and all you've been involved in, looking ahead 5 years, hopefully we can look ahead 5 years, given all the challenges that we face right now. I'd also would love to get your take on classification of documents, but we won't talk about that today either. But give us your sense of where you see the challenges, both globally and domestically, in the next 5 years that corporations, big or small, can have an impact on by being more strategic and more proactive.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, as I started to get at a second ago, I think it's really important for corporations to understand that we're not just going through a choppy year here in terms of this global turbulence. There's a lot of conversation, I think, about, okay, so there was the pandemic and there's supply chain upheaval and Russia invaded Ukraine and, and when are we going to get back to normal? Unfortunately, I think we're in a new normal. You have, as I mentioned, this paradigmatic shift from global war on terror to the rising, again, of Russia and China and other state adversaries, which are increasingly empowered and feel capable of taking on the United States. And when they take on the United States, that means they're taking on American business, whether that's through cyber attacks or limiting access to markets or compromising business assets that we have overseas. This is the new normal. And so as I look ahead 5 years, I expect that to unfortunately become more and more turbulent. I think that U.S.-China relations are on a path to become more tense. We see obviously all the activity in the South China Sea and with Taiwan, and I think that should be on the minds of most executives. Not just those, by the way, who have operations in China or in East Asia. Executives who just have organizations here need to be concerned, given the cyber angles, given the espionage angles, intellectual property theft, foreign malign influence and investment. You got to be thinking about these things. And the one other thing I'll throw out there is, so I think you have that global piece that's going to get unfortunately worse over the next 5 years, but technology too, right? There's this intersection now between global threat and technology. And I think we are just beginning to wrap our minds around the security implications of some of these emerging technologies. You, I'm sure, are more familiar than I am with blockchain and crypto and all the disruptions that are going on in the financial industry. My mind also goes to the metaverse, which I know has sort of become this jokey phrase in some ways. Right. What is this thing? Well, I think companies that are trying to build metaverse platforms or are thinking about that, they need to be thinking about the security implications of what they're doing now, right? I mean, if you have in 5 years virtual reality training grounds that terrorist organizations could use to plan operations or foreign intelligence services could use to compromise information, and your company ends up being involved in that or enabling that or being liable for that in some way, better to think about those things now and build with that on the mind from the ground up than to never think about it until it happens once the technology and the threat environment have coalesced in a few years to get it there.
Oh, that's very helpful. Mark Freedman, love to have you back to talk more about some of these issues in the future. So we will definitely reach back out. CEO and founder of Rebel Global Security. The website is rebelglobalsecurity.com. Mark, again, thank you so much for sharing some time today. Stay safe and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, John. Good to be here.
Thanks for listening to another episode of AML Conversations, brought to you by AML RightSource. To make sure you're staying up to date with what's going on in the industry, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast to get the latest episode.